Good afternoon to everyone. Thanks to you for coming. What I'm going to do here is to argue that aesthetic communication is a valuable supplement in the negotiation of diversity and maybe thereby contribute to a cosmopolitan education. Let me give an approximation to what I mean by aesthetic communication. I define it by its medium. One way of putting it would be, as far as texts are involved, that aesthetic communication communicates between the lines, while discursive communication communicates on the lines. Another way would be to say that aesthetic communication articulates meaning by form, by patterns and structures, lines, sounds, colors, movements, by style and composition. I leave it at that, since I'm going to discuss the biblical tale of the construction of the Tower of Babel, and it may perhaps illustrate what I mean by aesthetic communication. The next term I expand on is the term cosmopolitanism. There are numerous conceptions of it, but I use it in a heuristic way. A minimalistic point of departure would be the stance taken by Hansjörg. I quote, "Cosmopolitanism is a name for an orientation toward self, others, and world. In this orientation, a person or community juxtaposes reflective openness to new influences with reflective loyalty toward the tried and the known. Put another way, cosmopolitanism is a name for an outlook toward the challenges and opportunities of being a person or community dwelling in a world of ongoing social transformation." End of quote. There are at least two aspects to consider. One is the epistemological, in the sense that cosmopolitanism is about critical openness for the new and the critical appreciation of the proved. Then there is the moral and ethical aspect, in the sense that there is a balance to consider between commitments toward the local and the world at large. Anyway, the approach of Hansjörg and collaborators suggests a powerful perspective that counteracts some of the pitfalls of the concept of cosmopolitanism. One of these is the idea of cosmopolitanism as detachment from the local, and the idea of the cosmopolitan as a globetrotter who dwells in various local cultures for some time, but stays without deeper commitments. Another misunderstanding would be to take cultural heterogeneity as a measure of cosmopolitanism. For instance, there are about 300 languages spoken in London today, but that does not make it a cosmopolitan place. Still another pitfall is a special emphasis on cultural roots, which could lead to an uncritical loyalty towards particular groups or local identities. I think, however, the above definition should be supplemented with the perspective on cosmopolitanism as praxis, or more precisely, as a certain structure of communication. Perhaps one could also say that what the authors call an orientation or outlook may be taken as a quality of communication and interaction. In this respect, I think some observations about aesthetic may contribute to a cosmopolitan education. I approach my topic through a paragraph in Genesis. You have it on the handout. Now the whole earth had one language and one speech, and it came to pass, as they journeyed from the east, that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. Then they said to one to another, "Come, let us make brick and bake them thoroughly." They had brick for stone, and they had asphalt for mortar. And they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower whose top is in the heavens. Let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth." But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the sons of men had built. And the Lord said, "Indeed, the people are one, and they all have one language. And this is what they begin to do. Now, nothing that they propose to do will be withheld from them. Come, let us go down and there confuse their language, that they may not understand each other's speech." So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of all the earth, and they ceased to build the city. Therefore its name is called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth. And from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of all the earth. End of quote. So before I discuss some features in this remarkable tale, I must make clear my understanding of the genre as such. I do not read it as a holy text, but as a poetic reflection on the topic. Thus, I do not consider the ideas I'm going to draw from it to be divine revelations, but rather the results of human thought. This being said, I find the tale interesting in several respects, as it pinpoints what I think are essential aspects of communication and diversity. The first point to make is that of an original unity. This represents a fundamental question for a cosmopolitan education. Looking at today's political conflicts, one can but wonder whether there is a common ground on which the parties could hope to meet. Even theoretically, there are voices like Gert Biesta's that suggest the existence of a radical diversity. Among others, he is inspired by Hannah Arendt, who in her analysis of the vita activa points out that action in contrast to labor and work is a beginning and irreversible. Although there is forgiveness and the possibility of healing, actions cannot be undone. I think that herein lies the gift of existentialism to our self-understanding. Each and every one of us is something new in the world and a new chance. However, if there were an original unity, an original sameness, this would have radical consequences for cosmopolitan education. It would mean that the final aim is to reunite what has been dispersed. In the opposite case, departing from the premises of an original diversity and incommensurable strangeness, a cosmopolitan education in the true meaning of the word would not be possible. In this case, we would just have to learn how to arrange ourselves with other strangers. There would be some kind of coordination, but no communication, no sharing of experience and of purposes. Another point in the biblical tale that may be commented on is that it has a global perspective. This perspective lifts it out of its mythic context, since the mythic world is a world of dichotomies: gods versus titans, people versus gods, ourselves versus barbarians. And in the tale we meet an awareness of diversity, not a juxtaposition of ourselves and the others. Everyone is the other. It is actually the first written document I know of that claims diversity as a fact and imagines that the speaker could be everywhere in the world. There are then two main aims for cosmopolitan education. One is the moral idea of global community, the original unity of mankind. And in saying this, I realize the shortcomings of this idea. I think it has to be extended to life or even Earth as such. There's a beautiful analogy in the novel Anyada, published in 1956 by the Swedish writer and Nobel laureate Harry Martinson. It describes life on a huge spacecraft, Anyada, meaning despair in ancient Greek. The craft is Mars-bound, having abandoned Earth, which has been rendered uninhabitable. The craft has lost its course and is captured by the gravitation of Earth, circling aimlessly and helplessly around it. And this can be read as an invitation to a global perspective on Earth as well. Satellite pictures of the Earth show her as a spacecraft, surrounded by a tiny layer of grey air gravitating in and surrounded by an immensely vast space which is utterly uninhabitable. Also, there is no alternative. Returning to the biblical tale, I think a further point is to be made, namely about language, which is identified as the central medium of diversification. Indeed, in situations of conflict and strife, we often hear the remark that the parties simply do not speak the same language. They may use the same words, but they mean different things, and the parties may not even realize it. The tale suggests that the diversity of languages is the central dividing factor in a cosmopolitan education. Language then would be a critical factor. The immediate consequence of this insight is to learn one or more foreign languages. This, of course, is useful in any case, but it also means a dramatic decentration. The pragmatist language of philosophy, Wittgenstein, for instance, has suggested that to speak is to partake in practices. Thus, to learn a foreign language is to learn to partake in foreign practices, to enter a new world. A second, but perhaps even more important, consequence of the linguistic perspective on cosmopolitan education is the cosmopolitan perspective on language, meaning a reflective stance on the mother tongue. As soon as one starts to reflect on one's own language, the distinction of the ancient Greek between the human language spoken by his or her own kind and the incomprehensible bra of the barbarians is suspended. Then my mother tongue, which is the ground I stand on and the air I breathe, ceases to be a natural thing which can be taken for granted. It becomes instead, bearing in mind the place of birth, a thing of chance, a means of communication amongst numerous others and dramatically different ones. It becomes a thing not only of convention, but a thing belonging not to me personally, but to the community. I cannot do with it as I please, but have to take care of it and cultivate it, even more so as I realize its vulnerability and its vital value. This denaturalization of the mother tongue is at least an inconvenience and more often perceived as a narcissistic offense or even a threat. Inconvenience inconvenient it is because the acquisition of a foreign language demands considerable effort and time and energy, while the rewards are more or less deferred. It can be looked upon as a narcissistic offense, as it seems to imply that there may be some flaw or something wanting with one's language or communicative skills or both. And at any rate, it makes you feel helpless and stupid long before you are able to enjoy the fruits of your toils and troubles. It may even be perceived as a threat to one's identity long before the mastering of a foreign language reflects one's language as enriched, valuable, enjoyable, and an object of pride. These are obstacles that must be addressed by teaching methods, since the reflective attitude towards one's language probably can only be acquired by learning foreign languages. Returning to the biblical tale, let us dwell a while on what is identified as the source of diversification of language. What the builders of the tower set out to do was to make a name for themselves, building something to identify with, and something that would prevent them from being scattered throughout the world. That is indeed an interesting point, as the tale discloses the paradoxical function of identity. On the basis of Arendt's distinction between labor, work, and action, we observe that the storyteller identifies the work as the means and the media of identity. It is perhaps not totally in agreement with Arendt's position, which is that it is action, that is communication, that reveals who we are. Even so, Arendt finds that it is work, the production of objects designed for use, that constitutes the world of things and gives it stability. Hence, the biblical tale may not be much of the track when it suggests that people are identified and identify themselves by their work and find in the artifacts the physical tokens of their community. At the same time, this name, this identity they acquire is also the means and media of distinction and diversity. In the tale, the very aim of remaining united generates the opposite effect. There is a clear caveat about the counterproductivity of the struggle for identity. Identity is not only a power that joins and unites people, which is the professed purpose of the people in the tale, it is also the quality and the power that disperses people and sets them apart and up against each other. As to consequences, one should look perhaps in the opposite direction and heed John Dewey's perspective, which is that community is constituted by conjoint activity and thus by common experience. Language is clearly a central part of activities, but it is also more than and transcends these activities. If these reflections have some merit with regard to cosmopolitan education, then one may inspect more closely the media and the point of departure, which was the poem. I take an observation made by Aristotle in his Poetics as a point of departure. Aristotle states that literature is based on mimesis, or better, representation of actions and persons. He thereby sets literature apart from theoria and identifies it as a non-propositional and transformative reconstruction of experience. As we represent experience, it changes, develops, clarifies. It becomes more accessible to communication and reflection. Aristotle uses two central terms in order to designate the topics or content of such a representation, namely mythos and ethos. The former, mythos, refers to the structure of action, spatial and temporal. The latter, ethos, refers to the mental structure of the actors. With respect to the biblical tale, that means that by representing patterns of action, the tale broaches the issue of production of objects, and by representing mental patterns, discusses the motives for this production. And before I expand on these topics, another observation of Aristotle may be helpful. In a comparison between the historian and the poet, Aristotle suggests that the difference is not that the one makes prose and the other rhymes. Instead, I quote, "The difference is that the former relates things that have happened, the latter things that may happen. And for this reason, poetry is more philosophical and a more serious thing than history. Poetry tends to speak of universals, history of particulars." End of quote. Thus, in contrast to historiography, literature does not report factual and singular actions or occurrences, but represents the possible and thus identifies general patterns. Literature then is a medium of discussion of action, of patterns of action and motive. If we read it as such, there emerge particular tensions. One tension between the factual and the possible. Another between the factual and the desired. And still another one between the factual and the moral. Taken at face value, it could be said that the tale explains in a chain of acts, actions and motives, the production of bricks of a city and a tower that reaches the heavens, and God counteraction, the emergence of a huge variety of languages and the global settlement by people. But behind these systemic suggestions, there appears an inquiry into desires and morals. This may be a cautionary tale against presumption and arrogance. In this case, the impetus for the tale is the quest for fame, made possible and possibly instigated by the ability to make tools. Then the story goes like this: abuse of the ability to make tools in order to gain fame, followed by God's punishment. Nonetheless, behind this tale, there appears still another tale, one about power struggle, and a depiction of God that is not very flattering for the latter. The people's bid for power seems thus so threatening to God that he feels compelled to obliterate their coordinated action and even their common purpose. However, most and foremost, the tale can be read as an elegy in Friedrich Schiller's meaning. The elegy for the German poet and philosopher is a fictitious projection of an ideal state into the remote past. It carries no pretense of historic truth. The purpose of this projection is twofold. First, there is a criticism of present time, where the ideal of mutual understanding and cooperation seems to be spurned. And second, the elegy aims to preserve this ideal and to keep it and the hope alive that it at some point in time will be realized. In this sense, the tale is critical about the conflicts of present time, about striving for particular identities, and it is utopian by promising a possibility of mutual understanding and of a common purpose sometime in the future. One of the important points of the previous analysis is to underline that the decisive difference between the historical account and the poetic tale is that they give us two entirely different objects to consider. In the former, we are confronted with reported facts, and we are implicitly or explicitly expected to decide whether the reported events really happened or happened in the way they are reported, and if they are correct, what we may learn from them. The tale may even be taken as a prohibition against learning foreign languages, since that could be constructed as an evasion of God's just punishment. In the case of fiction, on the other hand, we are confronted not with facts, but with the imagination and the thought of a storyteller, and may enter into a dialogue with her or him as to what the story means and how it could be understood. In other words, we are confronted with the teller's suggestions of understanding and with ambiguous suggestions at that. We understand, moreover, that the teller reconstructs action and character in such a way that highlights certain patterns and structures of the teller's experience. It thus makes action and persons understandable and open for normative reflection. Fiction, and thus aesthetic communication, is an invitation to reflection on and dialogue about praxis. Yet another valuable perspective on the biblical tale may be found in Friedrich Schiller's literary theory. The poet defines literature as the opposition and tension between empirical and moral orientation, and the integration of these two aspects. Although a perfect balance and a total integration is impossible on principle, thus the single art object will deviate to some extent from the ideal balance. There is a literature, the satire, that is predominantly empirically and thus theoretically interested, that is interested in facts, and a literature, the elegy, that is predominantly morally interested, that is interested in ideals. Either way, the essence of the literature is the reconciliation of fact and ideal, and the validity criterion for it is how well the factual and the ideal are perceived and integrated in a given work. A comedy, as part of the satire, for instance, tends towards the empirical and theoretical and wants to expose the world's deficiency to laughter and the reason. However, unless comedy is sufficiently ideally motivated, it produces at its best just cold laughter and is then of little aesthetic value. Even worse is the comedy that is theoretically weak and unable to transcend triviality. It is simply despicable. Schiller calls the highest form of literature ideal proper, and it comes nearest to a balance and reconciliation of ideal and the factual. The ideal, in other words, shows how moral ideas like love, justice, friendship, and loyalty may be realized under given societal circumstances. Thus, the ideal does not depict an ideal situation by ignoring adverse societal facts and by escaping reality, but identifies and presents the ideal possibilities of actual society. In this sense, the idyllic is only a faint aspect of the biblical tale. Schiller would probably judge it as a satire. The main point to be made here, however, is that literature does not isolate norms and rules from societal facts, but makes the conflicts between ideal and facts visible, that being its critical function, and at its best suggests a path from the factual to the ideal situation, that being its utopian function. As a further perspective on art, I would like to present an observation made by the neo-Kantian philosopher Susanne Lange. Lange distinguishes between presentational and discursive symbolism and points to the special ability of presentational symbolism to articulate complexity. Presentational symbolism would correspond to my concept of aesthetic communication. And this ability to articulate complexity is due to its method of projecting thought, which is defined by the endless variety of pattern. Since aesthetic communication communicates by form, form is endlessly variable and thus able to express complexity and subtlety. Discursive symbolism, on the other hand, is defined by semantics and syntax and projects thought by projecting one concept at a time and stringing the concepts one after the other into a proposition. This mode of projection allows a relatively distinct articulation of thought, but restrains the ability to capture complexity. This trait of aesthetic communication is important for several reasons. It explains why this mode of communication is especially apt for communicating feelings. It is also necessary in every negotiation of social relations. And last but not least, I think that the increased intricacies of societal structure only can be negotiated properly by this mode of communication. One last aspect of aesthetic communication should be mentioned, and that is its ability to articulate the forbidden and to excommunicate it from discourse. This is an aspect especially Sigmund Freud has highlighted in his dream analyses, and that has become a common experience in art criticism. I have met this aspect in the analyses of fairy tales, where the criticism of oppression and of abuse of power is sometimes very explicit, while other channels of denunciation seem to be blocked. The dream as an instance of aesthetic communication, and it is a communication with oneself, is interesting in at least two ways. First, it shows the power of aesthetic communication to retrieve and to articulate the repressed and the denied, the forbidden. But it also shows the possibility of corruption. Thus, dreams may not only depict the forbidden drives and wishes, but simultaneously may represent their interdiction as well, and thus deviate and distort the original impulse. More often than not, we do not understand dreams because of this deviation and distortion of the original impulse. Appreciated as a mode of communication and reflection, and compared with propositional communication, one can say that art and aesthetic communication in general allows for a communication that is exploring, inquiring, suggesting, instead of asserting. As a matter of fact, it is not able to articulate propositions. And thus it does not put forward explicit moral or theoretical demands to take, argue, or defend certain positions. Also, fiction allows for a communication that is more tolerant with respect to ambiguity and more resilient with respect to excommunication. By pointing out possibilities of fiction, I by no means want to devaluate discursive communication or argumentation. Arguments are valuable tools for taking informed and considered decisions. There is in arguments an ambition and an expectation of universalization, which I think is indispensable for action. And I cannot imagine a cosmopolitan education without an education for argumentation and discourse in Habermas' sense. However, one should also be aware of the clear limitations of discursive communication with respect to complexity and even to praxis as a whole. Thus, there is a time for aesthetic communication as well. At the end of this reflection, I want to come back to the question of community. Community and rationality, I think, are inseparable, and thus a community, I quote, a community of those who have nothing in common, which is a title of Lingis, 1994, seems to me a self-contradiction. When Dewey, in his reflections on democracy, points out that it is not enough to have common aims and interests, but one also must be aware of having them and having them in common, he is perfectly right. However, democracy also depends on the fact that its communities are open for each other, and the fewer structural constraints for communication there are, the more democratic is the society. I wanted to argue that aesthetic communication is, like discursive communication, a means of rationalization, which I think cosmopolitan education is about. Rationalization does not mean uniformity, as Gerd Biester seems to suggest, but means instead, or on the contrary, an increment of susceptibility for conflicting positions, and the continuous transformation of what is rational in the face of diversity. So in this sense, diversity is not only a fact, but is indispensable. It is a necessary precondition for rationalization. Otherwise, we would have nothing to rationalize about. Aesthetic communication then may be seen as a valuable medium of meeting otherness and making sense of it. Art is subjected to no less rigorous demands on rationality than is discursive communication and argumentation. Who, for instance, would deny the biblical tale rationality? And how can one assume a radical societal and cultural diversity in the face of this tale that speaks to us through the millennia? I thank you for your attention. We have now time for about 5:20 for questions, comments, discussion.
My name is Miss Christiansen Grovera. I've been here and studied different kind of subjects and especially languages. First of all, to be a global citizen, I do not actually find it so difficult to achieve that kind of goals. But identity, first of all, do you really mean that an identity is something we can struggle against? I'm more in the way of thinking an identity is a result of where you are born, your education, your experiences, and your attitude. And maybe the last one, a global communication with global people. Yes, that's very interesting, but there is a very much but. If you are sitting talking and have a communication with somebody or several persons, there is a difference if you are a free person or, for instance, if you are sitting together with person who have to take care of what they are going to say in order to be punished. Yeah. So there is a lot here, but first of all, identity, may one struggle to be an identity, or is that something we are born into, and develop during lifetime?
Yes, I don't think we should struggle against identity. I think identity is indispensable for us human beings. But I thought this tale was interesting because it lifts up this paradoxical function of identity. The strive for identity can have counterproductive effects, results. That struggle for identity can be can set us up against each other. We have examples in nationalism, religious fundamentalism, conflicts between sexes, whatever we decide to build our identity around has always this counterproductive potential within, and we should be aware of it. And I think an education should have this in sight, that identity is a two-edged sword. It may cut both ways. But yes, we can't be without.
My name is Hansjörg, and I have also been studying at the Institute for Educational Leadership here in Oslo, and also studying in other universities, over in Boston University, down in academies in Germany, and I meet the cosmopolitan attitude in especially the universities. When it comes to the development of individuality, I have came across internationally that people with a Norwegian background has been key people within developing cooperation, working for actually peace, the basic human rights, and then you have a common basis between all these institutions, international institutions and that sort of thing. And when I dropped by the university today, I was interested in finding out the international or global communication which goes on now, and it's much more complex and effective when you have the internet and you could talk to the people, you can get information from all nations all over the world, and you will be also seeing in the university environment that you have many international students where we in a, I don't think it will be overnight, the human race have been fighting wars for 20,000 years, and the cosmopolitan attitude is best taken care of and developed if you have peace, stability, and you can have cooperation to promote whatever takes the promotion of a better society based on the basic human rights. So the idealism of cosmopolitanism, I think it's very important, and that this university should get the communication and the internet and these new tools implemented into the present setup with studies and that sort of thing, and the Institute for Educational Training and that sort of thing is, of course, an important piece of this work. So here we have a lot to do in order to promote cosmopolitanism, which I think is very important. And I have experience traveling around from Russia to Soviet Union, from Russia to America, and down in, now I'm settled down in Spain. And I think the student body in all these countries are just waiting for the time when we have stability and interaction between countries and universities all over the world, actually. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I mean, that's comment, hardly a question. But I thought, while you were talking, I thought about universities' practices and how useful the term of, or concept of cosmopolitanism is also in respect to the practices of our university. It is right that universities are, in its outlook, cosmopolitan. They are really universal, or want to be. But when you look at the incentive system for publication, for example, you could say, well, they have a special bonus for international journals, but they discard the local. When I am publishing in Bedre Skole, it's the journal of the teacher's journal, then there is no publication points. That is as if I hadn't communicated, even though teachers are perhaps our most important addressees. And so this term of cosmopolitanism invites to look both ways to the how do we take care of the local and how do we take care of the global, the others. And I think as far as universities are concerned, we take too much concern of the global, communicating with a few experts. Nobody else reads the stuff we are writing, and and the people who are really concerned are left on the side. So that's really a useful concept, I think.